Good afternoon. It feels like afternoon.
It's been a while.
It's been a bit. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. Welcome everyone to the UBC Learning Circle on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people. Today we have a special session with Sam Saruda?
Yes.
Saruda. And she is going to share with us her philosophy and approach to evaluation in an Indigenous context, which is really exciting. And so from you as audience members, we invite your questions throughout. So I think what Sam is going to do is she's going to share a little bit of her knowledge, and there will be opportunities for questions from you and even a case study for you to look at. So we'll try to do that in a truncated time, and to let you know that perhaps we'll have another session that is longer, that we can do a deeper dive into this work. So we appreciate everyone's patience. If everyone out there could just let us know where you're from and what you are, why you're interested in program evaluation, it would be fantastic to hear you. I haven't introduced myself, and I'm sorry about that. My name is Leah Walker, and I am of English and Nakapma ancestry on my father's side, and I am Danish on my mom's side, so Scandinavian connection there. So I'm really thrilled to have you here, and really nice to see all the participants. Participants, please introduce yourself so Sam knows who you are, and thank you so much. Again, over to you, Sam.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah, for your introduction and for inviting me here to the Learning Circle. It's exciting to be a part of all of the good work that you're doing here. So hi everyone, thank you so much for your patience and perseverance in connecting today. Sometimes, do you ever feel like the ancestors are just looking at us laughing? Being like, they have like 17 screens and all these things, and they're just like, what is going on? They must just be cracking up there. So that's, so I guess on that note, I too would like to acknowledge the unceded ancestral and traditional territories of the Musqueam people. Let the ancestors know that I'm here with good intentions, and I encourage you all to do the same. Maybe take a moment to reflect on the traditional territory that you two are able to live, work, and play on. So I'm really grateful to be here today to talk a little bit about, I guess, my approach and some of my experiences with doing program evaluation in Indigenous context. And I called the session Unpacking Research and Filling Up Our Toolboxes, because I think evaluation and research have a lot of commonalities. Of course, evaluation is just sort of a subsect of research that I think constantly requires us as evaluators to, as well as researchers, to sort of unlearn, relearn, constantly sort of shifting around our skills and competencies and wanting to continually fill up our toolboxes. So I think on that, with that sort of spirit, I'm wanting to really sort of position myself as a learner. I'm sort of continually challenging myself, pushing myself in my field and in other ways, and so I think I just want to acknowledge that I'm by no means an expert, but very much a humble learner. So I want to start by, and are you clicking for me? Okay, well,
I will click the next slide. I will do that.
Okay, thank you. So I like to introduce myself just in terms of my relations as well. So my family is pictured here on the next slide, as well as my partner, and then my connection to place. So on the left is the unceded Coast territories that I was very privileged to be raised on, and then on the right is my a picture from my reserve with the Spasm First Nation in the Fraser Canyon. Yeah, little tiny community. So bonus points if anyone has heard of Spasm before.
I have. It's close to, Seabird Island, actually, and the Katma territory. It's all that river, right?
Yeah, and I have family connected to Seabird way back. So,
nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
And so the next picture I want to acknowledge on the next slide is my team that I had the opportunity and the privilege to work with at Reciprocal Consulting. So for the past 7 years I've been doing, it's almost been 8 years, and I've been doing evaluation work, and Kim is my mentor. She's the second in from the left, and just really want to acknowledge her and the rest of the team who I think a lot of the work that I present on, it's also that sort of an Indigenous concept of knowledge and like proprietary, and it's really shared, and I don't own it, so I just wanted to acknowledge my team in terms of my learning journey, and just thank them for all the work that they've done to fill up my toolbox over the years, and Kim in particular. So the next slide is just sort of, this is what I said I was going to do in the little description of this event, and so just definitely wanting to sort of do an introduction. It'll be really brief at this point, as well as share some strengths and wise practices in evaluation, as well as some complexities, and then also just sort of, I guess, share a couple of opportunities I think there are for the field in Indigenous program evaluation moving forward. And another way to look at this on the next slide is just sort of a little bit more, I guess, visually, in terms of, I'll start at the roots and really lay a foundation of the field, as well as a little bit of a very brief historical context that I think is important to ground us in our work. The sort of then think about moving up in terms of the trunk of a tree, if you will, in terms of the practices and approaches of evaluation, and then through to the opportunities and the wings and opportunity for growth moving forward. So Aurelia initially asked me
I love this picture.
Thank you. To send in a picture of what I thought would represent, or something, I guess, to advertise the workshop, and I sent this, and she was like, so, very nice picture, Sam, but how does that really encapsulate program evaluation? And she didn't question me quite like that, but I felt the need to kind of, so I said I would just describe it in my intro. So the way that so I use a lot of nature metaphors, and I just apologize in advance if that gets really annoying but that's often how I just sort of like make sense of things as I journey through the world. But I thought about this as being kind of like, you know, when people think about evaluation sometimes, unless it's your job and you live and breathe it and it's your work, I think a lot of the time it's sort of this added thing that like kind of like you get pulled into the undertow of like your normal paperwork or whatever you're doing, the admin that you're doing in your job, and then you're doing evaluation on the side of your desk, and it's overwhelming, and you're kind of like, I know for me sometimes I've kind of, don't want to say like drown sounds very dramatic, but like you're drowning in like all of the tasks of your day to day. But I think hopefully with this a little bit of an intro and sharing a little bit about my philosophy to evaluation, there's an opportunity to turn tides, if you will, and sort of see the strengths and sort of beauty in terms of, I think, self-determination and research and empowerment for Indigenous peoples to use evaluation to strengthen our communities in a different way than we maybe haven't before. However, I think when people often hear the word evaluation, maybe they look more like this.
Yes.
And this is more the face that we get when we sort of start workshops, and people are like, oh my gosh, you know, what on earth is this about? And even the term evaluation in communities, I mean, it has kind of that like, I don't know, maybe an instant association is like a measuring stick or some sort of like, you know, quantitative tool. But hopefully that changes as we talk a little bit more about it. So maybe take a moment to reflect on what you think of with program evaluation, just in terms of a baseline of where you're at right now. Maybe you're like a cheerleader for it, maybe you're already on board, or maybe you're kind of more the like kind of trepidatious mindset. But we'll see if we can sort of...
Well, it's not necessarily, I just want to say, It's not necessarily assessment or anything like that. It can be, but I think if you think about it as formative rather than summative,
yes.
I think it's great,
yes.
right? So if you're thinking about, like, for example, just to use this to evaluate just everything I've learned so far about putting on WebEx today and all of our challenges, right?
Yeah.
So it's around creating a learning environment to improve what you are doing
Yeah.
and to really assess the impact of what you're doing, or if it has the intended impact that you have.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Is what I'm
Definitely.
thinking about.
Yeah, oh for sure. And I think it's almost like you've seen a later slide that I will definitely, you're dropping some good terms here. I'm excited to.
And I'm really excited about, just want to acknowledge some of our guests out here, that we've got some people that actually are doing evaluation in mental health, which is fantastic, and program evaluation, as we have Jordan's principle in our community, which is such exciting news that that's happening in Manitoba, in Opaskwayak. That's
Opaskwayak Cree Nation, yeah.
that is phenomenal, and Jordan's principle, I know, has been supposedly adopted here too, and it will be really interesting to see how it actually rolls out, and whether, care for our children and others actually happens expeditiously. And we've got someone from Cowichan, and we've got someone that is interested in cultural competency program evaluation, integral to service delivery. Love to hear more about that, Randy, and how that works and what you were doing.
So can just to pause, can people see the presentation right now? The slides as opposed to us?
I think so. Yes, we can.
Okay.
They can.
Okay.
So they can. They
Okay,
can see
great.
both. They can see both of us.
Okay.
Awesome. We're glad that that's working.
Okay.
And you can hear us. Fantastic. Yes.
Okay.
Here we go.
Perfect. Just wanted to double check. Okay. So, should we move
Yeah.
to the
Let's go on
next?
to the next slide.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So in terms of starting with the roots, I wanted to first just touch briefly on sort of the history of research and context in the field. So if you want to switch to the next slide.
This beautiful picture.
Oh yeah, and then one more.
One more slide.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a quote from Linda Tuiwaai Smith's book on decolonizing methodologies, and she is a Maori woman in New Zealand who has really changed the discourse in terms of Indigenous research internationally, and so I think it's just important to sort of think about maybe that initial fear or like knee-jerk reaction to the idea of evaluation, and really contextualizing that within a historical and cultural context in terms of colonization. So I think more traditional or classically since colonization, and especially since sort of I think how health programming, because that's our sort of focus in this context, has evolved over time. It's really been sort of the federal government or provincial government funding programs and requiring Indigenous communities to show that they are using the funds as they said they were going to. And so a lot of the time, whether it's for grants or it's for pilot programming, there's a requirement for evaluation, and that sort of I think has been kind of that paternalistic approach where often there's sort of cookie cutter surveys used, or tools that have been sort of supplied, I guess, to communities, or not, or they've had no say in it, and it's more external, and government comes in and does the evaluations themselves. So I'll just say it's been more of a top-down sort of approach, and I think how that's sort of shaped research, or that's part of how research is shaped, and more widely over time it's very much been research or evaluation on or about Indigenous peoples rather than by or for or with. So I think that's sort of a change that we're starting to see now, which is really exciting in terms of wanting to shift those the meaning and the purpose and the sort of the power of evaluation, and bringing it back into the hands of communities to lift up the good work that they're doing. That said, as an Indigenous person doing this work for almost 8 years, it's still kind of I guess humbles me, or keeps me humble in terms of going into community, and you think, oh, okay, like, well, because I'm First Nations, maybe people will not be quite as nervous to talk to me, but there still is I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a rightfully so, this sort of legacy of fear sometimes when you're a researcher coming in, and we've done a lot of work around the province and the country and really small communities that haven't necessarily been empowered or asked their opinion on a lot of different things. So anyways, I think it's just important to sort of just acknowledge that that's sort of, we're still in the midst of healing from this legacy, and are sort of at an exciting point now where research, the scope of research is starting to change.
And can I also just add to that in a way, like, I mean, this is evaluation, but I still also feel like inherent in that tool, you're basically, in some ways, you're summarizing things and you're putting it into a form that is making a statement about the work that you're doing. So it could imply a certain amount of judgment there too. So that can't help but come into the work, especially when maybe you're not confident in, you're working in the context you're in, and it might not, you might not have all the pieces together, or, you might be not doing it as well as you would hope to be doing it, or you think it might be. You know what I mean? All of those things that you're working within this context.
Of course, and I think that's even the word, evaluation, like it has the word value in it, which implies sort of a, judgment. Valuable for who, and I think I'll talk about that a little bit later on when we, remind me, just if I don't sort of naturally, to remind me to talk about sort of the importance of strength-based and community-driven indicators. I think that's an important thing to touch on. The next picture is, that's us from up on the mountain on Cyprus. I have to acknowledge my partner. A lot of these are her beautiful photos, and I'm grateful to be able to use them. I think it's nice to take a break from seeing a bunch of words on slides, but yeah, I think this is just sort of, I wanted to sort of say, in spite of past and current injustices, Indigenous people continue to demonstrate such resilience, openness, and we've got fighter spirits, to make this, to change the scope and approach to research. So wanting to come at this from a strengths-based perspective that is, but still, acknowledging the context that we're working within. So based on my experience, I think it's really important to sort of ground your inner evaluator, so to speak, to be able to grow your practice. So when I first started in the field, I didn't even know what evaluation was, to be honest. I had never heard of it before. All I knew was that I wanted to do work in Indigenous communities that was coming from a grassroots perspective, and I wanted to see if I could, just lend my skill set in any way, and so that's how I sort of got into it, and Kim took me under her wing, and one of the first things she did was give me this article written by Kirkness and Barnhart on the 4 R's of research with Aboriginal peoples. So that's, they put forward these 4 principles of respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. And so just briefly touching on them, I'm sure you can sort of put into play how these sort of principles may come about for you in your work, but I think respect is definitely valuing different types of knowledge, as well as wanting to respect that community members are experts in their own communities, and programmers are experts in their own programs. And so whenever you're doing research and you're coming in from I think an external place, it's so important to regard the people that are doing the work. I know I definitely always go into community like I don't know anything, and I just sort of go with open arms, open heart, and open mind, and being able to respect community protocols and the unique cultures that we're working with as well. Relevance is really ensuring that the evaluation being done actually connects to the community and their needs. So I think this is a really big one, and so for instance, I talked a little bit about the evaluations fitting the needs of government or funders. It doesn't have to be government, it could be other funding agencies, and so they have this need for evaluation, so to check it off. But I think what we really try to do, and I encourage others in their own evaluation practice, is to think about, well, who is the evaluation really for, and is there a way to also meet the needs of the community members, of the people that are running the programs, the staff, themselves, and make sure that it's actually going to be relevant to them. So for example, if the funders really want to have the quantitative, hard, summative numbers, how many people's health improved, But at the same time, if you also want to know, well, did I conduct my program in a safe space? Was it at the time that people needed? Could people get here? Was it accessible in language, accessible geographically? Those other pieces are really helpful. So to make sure that you work towards building an evaluation framework that's going to generate relevant findings for multiple stakeholders involved. And we use stakeholders a lot in the field. I think it's kind of shifting more, another way to look at it is evaluation users. So wanting to sort of balance those people's needs. Reciprocity is another big one, ensuring that everyone involved is benefiting, and especially sort of the researcher, evaluator, as well as the community that you're working with, that they're benefiting from the process and learning from each other, I think is really important, reciprocal learning. And then responsibility. I'll talk about this in the next slide, but really ensuring that a participatory process is taken, because that, I think, is what we have a lot of responsibilities as evaluators to adhere to certain standards and ethical principles, but ensuring that you understand how ethics or sort of the principles that may be really important to other communities, make sure that they're honored through the process as well. So on the next slide, and I'm sorry, I'm going to kind of try to get through quite a bit of stuff in a short time, and thank you in advance for your patience. I hope I'm not talking too fast or rushing. I'm just mindful of the clock a little bit. But so this is, I guess, an example of walking in two worlds, because that's something that we, as Indigenous people, I know as an Indigenous student myself, we're constantly sort of having this balance of walking in two worlds. And so these are standards put forth by the American Evaluation Association, which is the kind of a massive group that does a lot of international evaluators join AEA as well, so they're quite internationally adhered to standards, and I chose these ones just to touch on, and maybe I won't because this will be available afterwards too, and
yes.
I'll make sure that this is in PDF form so people can take it, so I won't go on too much, but I just wanted to sort of introduce utility, making sure the evaluation is feasible, that it's useful, that you're adhering to proprietary standards, that the evaluation is accurate, and that there's accountability throughout. And so we'll revisit those a little bit in a second. I'll give some examples. But this is the part that I wanted to sort of move into now, the sort of the trunk, if you think about that initial picture, and sort of thinking a little bit about some approaches to evaluation and the strengths and complexities. So on the next slide, so I just sort of give an example of each of those standards. And so if you were going to start out an evaluation, you can sort of picture sort of your initial meeting, whether if it's an internal evaluation, meaning you're doing it within your role, or if it's an external team, if you're on the consultant side, you've got your potential clients together, and or if you're or switch that lens as well. But either way, it's the first time you're meeting to talk about the evaluation. Number one thing for me in my practice that was always at the front of my head is I wanted to make sure it was going to be useful. Even though it's so fun generating, 200-page documents that the government doesn't even look at themselves. But
I know, right? Gotta be able to find that data.
Exactly, and so how can you sort of create findings that are going to be useful, as well as how can you deliver the findings in a useful way, I think is an important thing to think about as well. Really practical thing in terms of feasibility is the budget, how to make sure that you can actually get done the work that you need to, and I think that's a really important I'll talk about a complexity now, why not, that I think can be a really a huge challenge. So they say in the field, and it always makes me laugh because it's so not the case, but they say like the gold standard sort of for evaluation is that it's 10% of the program's budget should be towards evaluation. Never happens.
Right.
Never. If that happens, it just is
it's a miracle.
Seriously, what can I do with that budget? But normally we're working on like,
a minuscule amount.
Yeah,
0.01%.
More like 5% tops, I'd say would be like a generous evaluation budget. So I think that is a really important thing to think about, just in terms of, I know for me, am so cognizant that that the work that we get to do, or my team that we would do, was coming out of services, programs that are there to improve the health, the well-being of real people and communities. So just being aware of that you don't just like do research, all these things just for the sake of it, and be as efficient as possible, I think is something that we really strive, because we're so aware of the dollars, how it's hard to get funding, and a lot of programs are funded because of grants, and so it's not easy to do a grant application, and that takes a lot of time. So I guess being resource cognizant, I don't know if that's a term, but
and as you're saying as well, because the funds really need to be going towards serving the community.
Exactly.
You really want to make sure that it's going towards that and not just administration of the funds.
Exactly, that ultimately it's going to contribute to learning, to be able to grow programs, reflect, change them, adapt them, all for the, being able to improve the programming to meet the needs of the people that they're trying to reach. I think that's, in a nutshell, really a massive goal here. Accountability is a big one. We take a lot of minutes. I'm kind of like, I don't really rely on my brain a whole lot, or my memory, so being able to, so that's just like a really easy example, just so that you can look back and be like, what was that conversation where we hashed out all of the different needs, or evaluation questions, or those types of things. Accuracy, so I think engaging in participatory methods is one of the best ways to actually make sure that you're going to be developing accurate tools, as well as getting accurate data because of that. So and a way to do that is in partnership with the people that are actually developing the programs, or delivering the program. So if you're able to say, oh, I'm looking to are wanting to evaluate this question, do you think it would be best to ask about whether they've, okay, you know what, I'm realizing, why am I rambling about this? I can talk about this afterwards.
Yes, exactly, when we go into complexity. Exactly.
Yeah, there's so many things that are floating in my head that I'm thinking, I hope I have time to get to. And then propriety, and negotiating agreements, and making sure that multiple needs are going to be met.
So, and just, this is generally around evaluation, and the thing is, if you are embedded in your organization and want to perform evaluation processes, then it's, and I imagine that's for a lot of you out there thinking about evaluation in your program and including that as part of your work, or embedding it in part of your work. So it's not necessarily something, you still want to look at the way that you're framing some of those standards, or how you're thinking about it, but it might be a little bit different, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's an interesting point too, just sort of thinking about like embedding it in your work, because that's one way to, I think something that I'm always really aware of as well, is trying to minimize the burden on programmers and staff of programs, because I think adding on, oh, by the way, you need to collect how many people are going through the door in this and this and this, and a lot, and then people are like, oh my gosh, that's so much monitoring to do, so much data and admin work that's sort of collected on top of just the enormous task of doing your job. So I think maybe trying to think about ways to make it more feasible as well, and thinking of what data do you already collect in your work, and how can that feed into certain question too. So I think definitely really context dependent in terms of the internal evaluation side, which I will get at a couple of slides. So because this is sort of just an intro session and conversation around evaluation, I wanted to bring up, I guess, sort of the two often dichotomous, even though a lot of the time these processes or these overarching evaluation arms are embedded within each other. So one is the process, or formative, which is a term that Leah used earlier. So that part of evaluation is really around how the process of how the program has gone. So for sort of, I guess, the classic domains within formative or process evaluation, are reached. So are you reaching the participants, or are the participants coming that you intended? If it's a substance abuse treatment program for youth, are youth coming in the door, or adults coming in the door? And if so, do you need maybe a program that's geared for adults in that area? So asking who is coming, or if you're able to deliver programming to who you initially wanted to, is a really important part of that. The implementation of it, so I kind of mentioned before accessibility, or the availability is the program offered during the times when people need it. And so those pieces, as well as successes and challenges, are a big part of the process. So, what worked well, what didn't work well in the program, and are people satisfied? Satisfaction is often an indicator that government throws in there as well. As well as they really like the summative or outcome side of things. So are you seeing the changes that you hoped to make? So that kind of, so those intended outcomes, if it's going back to a substance abuse treatment program, maybe there's mental health programming or counseling involved. Are you seeing improved attitude or changed attitudes in terms of the use of substances? Are you seeing people using less? Are you seeing a community impact in the long term? So often with intended outcomes, there's kind of like a theory of change implied, where, so I guess this is another thing.
Yeah, if you do this, this will
happen. Or and that's often, I guess this is just reminding me of how program evaluation and program planning are often taught sort of simultaneously, because a lot of what goes into programs, of course, informs the way that you're going to evaluate it. So thinking about it that way, if I kind of tie in a tiny bit of that, I think program logic models used to be a really big thing for grants, and I think maybe we're seeing a little bit less of them, although I still would make the case that they are extremely helpful, especially if you're someone from outside of the program or the community, to understand something really quick. A program logic model basically just says everything that goes into the program, the money, the staff, all the inputs, that kind of thing, and then really what you want to see out of it. So it's sort of like kind of broken into outcomes in the short, medium, and long term. And in the short term is usually around changes in attitudes, knowledge or awareness. That's sort of like the first step to being able to change. And then the medium term is actually the behavior, what would be like decreases in substance use, would be what you would be hoping to see. And then the long term is more like the, maybe depending on the program, 2 to 5 to 10 to 20 year kind of change over time on a more community or societal level. So those are the two different types of evaluation, really in brief, but I think often those evaluations these days are very much not just one or the other. They're very much sort of wanting to understand how the process went, what came out of it.
There's so many discussion points around this, and so I'm inviting people that are listening in on this conversation. If you have any questions percolating around some of these terms, or even some of the evaluation that you're troubling or trying to frame, please feel free to write it in, and we will make sure that we answer it, even in this short time frame.
Yeah, definitely.
And I just want to say, because some of those longer term outcomes are very difficult to measure. You can make some correlations, but not always make it,
causality
is very difficult to measure, because you're in a certain environment, right? Like, you like to think, for example, that cultural safety education is actually making a difference. I've tried to measure that in some of the research that we're doing nationally, internationally. Like, yes, this one workshop actually had an impact, and then that healthcare provider provided better care to the patients, and we were to measure better health outcomes for the patients, because and we were trying to figure out measuring tools that would actually get at that, and it's very much more difficult to actually link those kinds of things to what you're doing, your programming.
Absolutely. Well, attribution theory is a big one, but I think just in short, if I were to respond just with like a really quick tip on that, is I think like a question that I often go to in trying to get at attribution is, if this program didn't exist, or if you didn't come to take this training or this course, would you have these changes in awareness, or just really trying to get at, like, if this didn't happen, or because of this program, just really being able to try and link to see. But it is hard when it's sort of like a chain reaction, really trying to think of sort of how to
the
do
real
education
chain,
in the long term.
because you're kind of doing it within a context, right?
Definitely.
So, really interesting.
That's a good point. So on the next one, I think just really this might this is, I guess, is just sort of the difference between doing evaluation internally and externally. Because I think maybe, I'm not sure, for those of you who are on the webinar today, what your roles are, if you are involved with evaluation right now. But I think, so just to briefly touch on the two, I think a lot of, there's definitely, as you can see, from my opinion anyways, pros and cons to both. I think if you're doing evaluation, say you're tasked as the internal evaluator for a department, you have the insider knowledge of that department, you know how it works, who maybe the key players would be to go and talk to if you wanted to spread the word about a survey. You kind of know, like, the what do they call it? Like the community champions, maybe if you're working in a community context, and you have sort of an understanding of that. It can be really cost effective too if it's already a part of your job. At the same time, maybe it isn't your sole role, and so it's an additional task and skill set that's on the side. Maybe there's limited capacities and also ethical issues, because people, would they be less likely to disclose the truth to you? That can be sometimes a tricky thing, but there are ways to mitigate that bias as well. For example, having other people, if you wanted to do interviews, having people that don't work in the department, hiring subcontractors or others to do the data collection can be important. And then on the other side, the external evaluation, and that's been my role for a while now. And so I think what can be really great about that opportunity is having that objectivity of not knowing super in depth already what the challenges have been, and as well as kind of other dynamics that may be at play in, like, the subculture of a work environment or community environment. We've done this before, and hopefully we know what we're doing, and are accountable to the standards that we need to in our professional field. But the challenges can be, it's an expense for a program in addition to their operating costs. We are coming in from the outside, and maybe there could be potentially conflicting priorities or values. That can be a reality of things. On the next slide, so I don't have a ton of time to go into methods, nor I think, nor should that really be the focus of this, but I think I just wanted to touch on, like, this is a really common image that I think people hear when they think of evaluation, just in terms of surveys, but really what I hope to communicate is that there's so much more opportunity in that, and so for instance, ensuring. So if we go to the next slide, it should be. Surveys can be great to get at quantitative information really quickly. They don't take a ton of time. They can be done online, which can be really convenient for people. Incentives can be helpful to encourage participation, doing draws, that kind of thing. They're pretty cost effective as well. On the other hand, qualitative. I'm a big proponent of qualitative research because I find it more fun, because it involves human interaction, and I really like that, because I think you gather just simply more rich data. So you I think quantitative is great to be able to tell sort of those, I think, numbers as well, kind of speaking to the needs of funders. Often they want sort of, that 80% of participants saw blah happen that they wanted to see, or they were changed, or they changed their behavior in a positive way. But then I often think to myself, why? Like, where did that, like, how did 80%, like, that's incredible, but how did that happen? And so to be able to really tell those stories, that's where you get that richness in qualitative data. So if you go to the next slide, I think that really is as well sort of the potential of decolonizing research when you use methodologies or research methods that are in alignment with the oral traditions of Indigenous peoples. So whether that's through interviews, can be done sharing circles, focus groups are really great. Photo voice is a really is becoming increasingly popular, especially with youth. And you can Google that for more specific methodologies around photo voice as well. But I think the takeaway in terms of the methods piece of this conversation, I think, really is around ensuring that they're driven by the community, because who am I to go in and be like, well, I think we must have a focus group, but maybe, you know, the information is really sensitive and people are not comfortable talking about domestic violence in a group setting, you know, so that would be a more natural sort of maybe lend itself more naturally to interviews, or, you know, especially if you're dealing with sensitive programming and content. So I think just being really responsive to the types of programs that you're working with, the communities that you're working with, and making sure that you respond, especially as an external evaluator, to what would be most appropriate. So this I have sort of this is what I hope happens when I send in my final evaluation reports, that like people's minds are just blown. I don't know if I'm that good of a writer, or if they're, but I really think that should be the goal, is to really spark new learnings, and because one thing that is really great about evaluation that I think maybe even our clients don't realize at the time, is that it is, at the very least, it's an opportunity to reflect, because we're all just like going, you know, in our day, we're so responsive, doing our work. In communities, it's a reality that they respond to crises first and foremost, and so, you know, maybe doing this, you know, evaluation isn't, of course, maybe they don't have time for to do just reflect and just sit around and think like, what, like, how did it go today? You know, like there's so much going on in a community context and in everyday life. So I think evaluation offers that space to really just pause, think, okay, how, like, what's been going great in terms of this program? Like, are people coming? Are they feeling heard? Are they feeling satisfied? And just sort of, you know, just a way to check in. So I think if we can even spark, you know, new learnings from an introspective perspective, I think that can be great too. Introspective perspective, that's cool. Yeah. So, but I think on that note, just before we switch, I think, or actually, yeah, we can switch. What makes a good evaluation? I think part of that in terms of how to spark, you know, people's minds, is really wanting to ultimately communicate the findings in a way that's going to be accessible. So if maybe you give the funder the report that they want, maybe you deliver a slide deck to communities, and they can, and the program director can do a presentation for their for the rest of the staff, because that I think is a really big one. So I guess to loop back to the reciprocity value, one of the 4 R's, I think we want to make sure that ultimately everyone who gave their input into the evaluation get the data returned, because that is one of the biggest things, I think, in the legacy of harmful research with our communities, is survey, census, whatever, never see the results, never see improved programming, don't know what happens with the findings after that, and that's where I guess where OCAP really, the principles of ownership, control, access, and possession, where that really stemmed from. Because so one quick way to describe, I guess, that is when we do when I do interviews, we make sure that we give the transcripts back to the participants through email, and give them a chance to, you know, make any changes, or if they have an afterthought, that they have the opportunity to add that in, and because I think that's people need to own their stories and their words, and so that's just, you know, one way that I think to deliver information and to be reciprocal through evaluation. But I guess another way is through community-friendly reports to make sure, because people don't maybe have heaps of time to read massive technical evaluation reports. So really, just my point there is just to consider your audience, make sure that it's going to be, the findings are going to be accessible to the people who need the findings.
Yeah, and I would imagine that visual heavy and concise, like, would
Definitely.
be really critical, hey?
Yeah, definitely. But I guess I guess that's a question that you can think of for yourself too. Like if you have experience with evaluation in your own work, maybe you've read of other evaluation reports before. Like, what do you think makes a good evaluation? And I'll just list a few things that I think that stand out to me. One is empowered participants. Did they feel like they had a voice to actually share their experiences? I think that's huge. Creating ownership and spaces of inclusiveness, creating meaningful, relevant data, that evaluations are honest, that they have practicable recommendations. That is one of like the most, like when I go to evaluation conferences, there are full day sessions on just how to create good recommendations, because get more funding
It's not going to help.
Not helpful.
No,
so
no.
how do you actually encourage and lift up good work, and not sort of just give these completely not feasible or really vague recommendations? And I think that having good recommendations can make all the difference to an evaluation. Sustainability planning is really big. So it's interesting. There's one of the grandfathers of evaluation in the U.S. or in the world, but he's American. His name is Michael Quinn Patton. We call him MQP because we're nerds. Mm-hmm. And MQP is like a guru, and he has this. He's written a textbook called, probably several at this point, called that are around utilization focused evaluation, or UFE, UFE I think people call it. And so what he actually does is he builds in sustainability. He advocates for building sustainability planning into the evaluation process. So what often happens is and again, this is sort of the ideal gold standard of the 10%. Sometimes budgets don't allow for this, but I'm throwing this out there as something that I think would be amazing to work towards in evaluation practice, is sort of, rather than just submitting the final report and being like, there we go, we're done. Instead, it's sort of like you send in the evaluation and then you plan a few meetings, whether it's like over a month or even just having one follow-up meeting, or even what MQP advocates is more over like a 3 to 6 month period, having continual meetings where it's like, having conversations about the recommendations. Are they able to implement it, and really thinking about how to, make sure that the findings have some sort of a sustainable impact on the program or organization. Building a culture of evaluation, I think that's amazing if that can come out of an evaluation process. So the people that started off with kind of the like freak out evaluation reaction, if they're, by the end of it, people are like, wow, this has been a really helpful exercise, and people are kind of more on board for the next time. I think that's an amazing outcome of the process itself. And then a really big one is creating meaningful social change. I think if that is sort of, that's the end goal, I think, for a lot of people and a lot of programs, goals. And if we can use evaluation to advocate, I think I'm noticing that there's kind of only 6 minutes left, so I'll kind of tie in some stuff that I was going to talk about at the end. Wow, this is so funny.
I know how fast. Look at how many we.
I know.
Even
There's
if
a
we
lot
would have
going
started
on.
On time, we probably wouldn't have gotten through all of that. But that's okay, because we'll have another one.
Okay.
We will have another one, so that's okay. So let's just see how far we can go.
Yeah, maybe I'll just, because I'd love to, if anyone has questions.
Please,
yes.
We'd love that right now if you have any questions.
Yeah, because I hope.
And do you want to go into your case study, or
I think
what do you
that's
want?
definitely would be a next time thing.
Okay, let's do that.
But what I was gonna say, just in terms of the advocacy piece, so and maybe as I chat, ramble for another minute. Maybe if anyone has any questions, otherwise I can ramble for a few more minutes. But I think. Really considering the Canadian context right now, in terms of we're in this process on a community, provincial and federal level of responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. There's a lot of work being done and at varying levels, and I think there's kind of this like hunger and appetite for this work in a different way than there's been before. And so I think if we're able to think about using evaluation specifically within the field, like how can we as evaluators even respond to the TRC is a really important question and think about, because measurement is in there. And what I wanted to highlight was that the TRC, and maybe others know this, but I think this is something that I continually think about in my field, is that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is not the first commission to happen on Indigenous peoples in Canada. I think it's there was RCAP, and then there was like the Bryce report, Penn report. Like I think it's the sixth technically. Maybe there were even more, but I know in terms of the big ones, about the sixth since the early 1900s, and the findings haven't been dramatically different. And RCAP really, like when you think about it, like what
was
like in
amazing.
terms of amazing, and in terms of the health and social measures, Indigenous people, like not a lot changed. And what happened was the AFN, I think, did an evaluation, or they did, I think, a report card. So the Assembly of First Nations did a report card on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which that commission happened in 1996. And 10 years later, in 2006, the AFN did sort of a report card on how RCAP, or how the federal government responded to so many acronyms. I live in an acronym.
I know.
world.
It's totally
How they
true.
responded to the recommendations that were in the final report from RCAP. What they found is they failed everything,
Oh my God.
except for National Aboriginal Day. That was the only thing that they
Only
they
recommendation
enacted.
they took up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I think is interesting about that is there's really a need to have ongoing monitoring, because I personally, and I'm sure many others, don't want to see another commission happen 10 years later and see nothing's changed.
Exactly.
And so what I think is really important is to, is even if you think about the TRC or the calls to action themselves, is to creating a measurement framework around that. And I don't know if that's happening, but I think from a governmental perspective, I think that's really important to hold accountability, because are they like, yeah. So anyways, that's I see there's a question, but
Yes, and I will answer that question.
Okay.
I just want to say too, in some ways, and this maybe goes to evaluation, and I'm not like RCAP for me, because I was studying and really thinking about that, and that was before the TRC creating curriculum in Indigenous health, and it was responding to that and some of the impetus around that. I think the TRC, and I may be wrong about this, but because of the stories that were embedded in the process, it has caught people's imagination perhaps in a way that I'm hopeful that there will be some results.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because everyone is using it as a touchstone, and using it as a call to others, and challenging each other, certainly nationally, internationally, around, so what are you doing about that?
Yeah.
Which calls to action are important, and what's relevant, and how are you being accountable?
Exactly.
We're all invited to actually create the pretty picture of how this is how we're being accountable.
Yeah.
And my worry is that creating pretty picture of this is how we're being accountable without actually trying to move that bar.
Yeah.
Because we really do need to move that bar.
Yeah.
So,
for sure.
Jessica says, I'm currently evaluating a local food school program, fantastic, and improving access to local and traditional foods, and struggling with what's most important to capture. Wow. Do you have any suggestions? Okay, I think we want to try to answer a little bit about that. Even though it's such a huge question, because basically there's more questions back to her, isn't there?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So let's do that. Let's figure this out. What are some of the key questions we want to ask Jessie?
Okay, well, the first question, so she has that. That's okay. So maybe we can just, I can plant some seeds, Jessie, and if you have any other questions, I'll throw my email up on the last slide before we end the session, so you can feel free to contact me. But so I would, my first question would be, so if you're evaluating it from internally or externally? Like, were you hired to, like, do you have internal knowledge of the program already, would be my first question, as well as, is there a logic model, any sort of, if not, is there initial program proposal that outlines sort of the activities and the key objectives, or anything about the intended outcomes that you would be hoping to see? If there's a program logic model internally, okay, so you know exactly kind of what's gone on. So I think the big things would be, again, to think about what were the goals when you started the program, what were the changes that you were hoping to see, then sort of breaking it down in terms of, because I'm guessing with a local food to school program, so you're wanting to improve access to local and traditional foods. Access can't really happen until people are aware, even, like, does the program have, I guess, is it awareness raising? Is it trying to, first of all, like, bridge connections and awareness, considering the impact of colonization, to even bring awareness to what traditional foods are, or local and traditional foods? Are students, is their knowledge changing? Maybe their attitudes are changing in terms of really what a traditional food is, why it's important culturally to people, as well as thinking about if they've been, if access is improved in terms of, I guess, are students able to reach the, yeah, I guess it's hard to know, but I think it's hard to know without really more of the program. But I think what's most important to capture would be really, I guess, reflecting on connecting your objectives to the activities of your program itself. So we're, and kind of getting at a little bit of the attribution piece that we talked to before, because of the pamphlets that you administered. See, clearly have no idea, but because of that, were they able to, you know, better have access to what they would have termed local and traditional foods in their community or context. But I will throw out my email if you have any more questions around that. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you for trying, and especially because you don't have the full context, and so I think what I'm seeing here, and of course we definitely would like to have you come back, Sam, and to go a little bit into a deeper dive on some specific case studies around evaluation, and teasing out some of the approaches and some of the tools that you would use in such evaluation would be fantastic. And perhaps to invite all of you to come back to the second one that we will have, to engage in that kind of dialogue. So we'll go into a little bit of deeper dive on some evaluation, and perhaps you can bring forward some of the challenges that you're experiencing or thinking about, and some of your framing questions. And what I heard, for those that are this is new for, is really thinking about the program goal and the outcome that you're wanting, and then of course the how you're going to get that in your plan, going back to that and really thinking about how different ways you could possibly measure that.
Definitely. I think the measurement piece is really important, but also thinking about I guess and just still thinking about Jesse's example, like if they're youth, you know, are there methods that are more appropriate? So like if it's a school setting, not wanting to take a ton of time out of their classes and curriculum, so is there a way to sort of like build in, like over lunchtime, a focus group where you're out in a farm? I don't know how your program goes, but you know, something like that. So I think, you know, really encouraging sort of adapting even how we think about evaluation, because sometimes it has to be a little bit more out of the box, and unpack your toolbox and refill it with ways that you think would gather the most meaningful, accurate data with the program that you're working with.
Yeah, that's great. It'll be nice too if next time you come back you can share some of your interesting approaches to you know, some of the tools in your toolbox to get at some of that evaluation. Thank you so much, Sam. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you,
Sam.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.